Hey everyone, and welcome, HIS 240 students, to this explainer on the history of Kentucky. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating and honestly deeply contradictory period, the Progressive Era, from 1900 to 1920. Now, for a higher-level historical analysis today, I really want you to look at this era not just as a timeline of random events, but as a dialectical clash. We're going to examine the intense friction between Kentucky's long-standing, often violent political traditions and this brand-new wave of middle-class reform. It was a period of massive change. But as you'll see, that change rarely came cleanly.
Okay, let's dive right in with a quote that absolutely perfectly sets the stage. In 1902, right in the thick of this era's insane partisan fever, former legislator James H. Mulligan delivered a poem at a banquet, and he finished it with these incredibly famous lines: "The landscape is the grandest, and politics the damnedest in Kentucky." Now, this wasn't just a clever rhyme. It was a razor-sharp historical observation. The turn of the century in Kentucky was just plain chaotic. Keep Mulligan's words in the back of your mind as we go. We're looking at a state desperately trying to push forward into a modern, progressive future while constantly being yanked back by the sheer, unadulterated madness of its own political machinery.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the paradox of progressivism. Second, monopolies and the agrarian revolt. Third, morality, suffrage, and control. And finally, war and the Great Retreat.
Section 1. The Paradox of Progressivism.
To really understand the political landscape of 20th century Kentucky, we have to start with the bloody, shocking event that essentially kicked the whole thing off. On January 30th, 1900, William Goebel was shot outside the Kentucky state capitol, and he passed away just days after being sworn in. To this day, he remains the only governor in American history to die in office from an assassination. Now, obviously, this was a tragic event, but structurally, it completely cemented Kentucky's national reputation as a lawless, violent place. And politically, it served as a huge warning to bold, charismatic reformers. The assassination actually empowered a new era of behind-the-scenes political machine bosses, guys who realized that to survive, you really had to control the game from the shadows, way out of the crosshairs.
And this created a really fascinating clash. On one side, we've got these shiny new progressive ideals, right? A push for corporate regulation, antitrust laws, middle-class respectability. But on the other side, we have the gritty reality of how power actually functioned. Old guard bosses, men like Percy Halsey, who didn't care at all about the spotlight, but meticulously commanded the votes. These bosses relied on patronage, backroom deals, and just blatant corruption. I mean, in one infamous instance, a precinct voted 219-0 by literally going down the alphabet, casting ballots for completely fake voters like A, apple, B, beans, and C, corn. You can't make this stuff up.
So the crucial point we need to wrestle with is, can a totally corrupt political machine actually deliver progressive reform? Historically, the paradoxical answer in Kentucky was, yeah, actually. The boy governor, J.C.W. Beckham, who took over after Goebel's death, managed to pass some significantly progressive legislation, like really strict child labor laws and funding for new state normal schools. But here's the catch. He didn't do it through pure democratic idealism. He got it done by relying heavily on the deeply corrupt but highly effective political machinery run by bosses like Percy Hawley. It's a brilliant illustration of how achieving high-minded reform often required getting your hands incredibly dirty.
Section 2. Monopolies and agrarian revolt. Let's shift our focus away from the politicians in Frankfurt and head out west, where desperate tobacco farmers were fighting an entirely different kind of battle. We need to define exactly what the Black Patch War was, because you shouldn't think of this as a traditional military conflict. This was a severe, desperate economic struggle. Tobacco farmers were quite literally being driven into absolute poverty by a massive corporate trust, the American Tobacco Company, which functioned as a monopoly and was artificially driving prices down way below the cost of production. So, in response, the farmers fought back. They formed the Planters Protective Association to pool their crops together and just hold them off the market. It was a massive grassroots economic strike. But, as with pretty much everything in this era, it escalated quickly. By 1909, when some farmers, who were known as hillbillies, refused to join the economic boycott, a violent paramilitary wing of the agrarian revolt emerged. They called themselves the Silent Brigade, or the Night Riders. And let me be clear, this wasn't a peaceful protest. These vigilantes threw on masks, rode out by the hundreds in the dead of night, burned trust tobacco warehouses straight to the ground, and brutally whipped the holdouts. Entire towns essentially became armed fortresses overnight. The brutal reality of Western Kentucky at the time was summed up pretty clearly. To join the Night Riders was both fire and life insurance. Think about what that says. It shows the absolute desperate lengths Kentuckians went to just for basic economic survival.
Now, ultimately, the crop pooling, along with a subsequent Supreme Court antitrust ruling, did actually break the monopoly. It gave the farmers a temporary agrarian victory. But all that vigilante violence permanently scarred the state's image, proving, once again, that in Kentucky, economic progress was very often bought with bloodshed.
Section 3. Morality, Suffrage, and Control.
In this section, we'll examine how the middle-class quest for political liberation ran directly parallel to a crusade for intense moral control. We see this dual nature build massively in the realm of women's rights. Aristocratic reformers like Laura Clay and Madge Breckinridge used their immense privilege to relentlessly campaign for equality. They utilized new tactics like organized suffrage marches and sharp political rhetoric to fight back against deeply entrenched sexist laws. And it was their relentless push through the Kentucky Equal Rights Association that is the exact reason why Kentucky became one of the very few Southern states to actually ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920.
But hey, we have to apply our higher-level historical thinking here. Consider the true dual nature of middle-class reform. The exact same progressive spirit that fought so hard to liberate women and successfully capped work hours to protect exploited children also believed it was the government's strict job to regulate public morality. It's a total paradox. Reformers viewed alcohol as the root of societal decay. So groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union pushed for immense social control, eventually achieving statewide prohibition in 1919, completely shutting down saloons in red light districts. Progressivism, you see, wasn't just about freedom, it was equally about control. Section 4. War and the Great Retreat. Finally, we are going to look at how global events, specifically World War I, served as both the ultimate catalyst and the eventual graveyard for Kentucky's progressive era. Trace this timeline with me. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, the progressive idea of communal sacrifice really peaked. Kentuckians observed gasless Sundays and meatless Tuesdays for the war effort. The whole concept of community widened to a global scale. But when the armistice was finally signed in 1918, that triumph immediately crashed into a horrific tragedy. The Spanish flu pandemic swept through the state, killing an estimated 15,000 Kentuckians. By 1920, all that patriotic fervor had completely evaporated. It was just replaced by utter exhaustion, profound grief, and a total reactionary retreat from public reform.
Congressman Alben Barkley summarized the post-war mood perfectly when he said, "You wonder if anyone ever wins a war." The progressive promise of a triumphant global democracy just felt like a massive lie to many returning veterans. And this was especially true for African-American soldiers. Despite serving their country with honor in Europe, they returned to a Kentucky where they faced continued segregation, deep racial hostility, and horrific lynchings, sometimes while they were literally still wearing their military uniforms. The humanist spirit of the progressive era had profoundly failed them at home.
Which leaves us with this final, powerful question to take into your Hist 240 class discussions this week. Did the progressive era actually modernize Kentucky, or did it just change the masks its leaders wore? We saw massive advancements in child labor and women's suffrage, sure, but we also saw democratic mandates achieved through corrupt political bosses. We saw economic fairness won through vigilante terror, and we saw high-minded moral reform masking intense social control and blatant racial inequality. Analyze that dialectic, students. The history of Kentucky is never just one simple thing. It is always, as Mulligan said, the grandest and the damnedest. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.